but yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about my sister Kathleen. She's the oldest one, and because this is kind of like this was a pretty formative thing for me. When I was 11 and she was 23, she got diagnosed with MS,
Oh,
and so MS can kind of relapse and remit sometimes,
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
there's other types, and hers was they call it primary progressive MS. So
Oh no.
it's a little bit like I think it. I mean, it's a different disease, but I think it's a little bit like ALS. It's just a lot slower, right? So she never really went into remission. It just kind of went through her body. It affected pretty much everything except for her eyesight. She never lost her eyesight, but just about everything else just got worse and worse, kind of a steady progression. And then she passed away 2 years ago.
Oh,
But the decade leading up to her passing was just kind of like constant near death scares. It was just like we were in the hospital constantly. There wasn't really a whole lot that they could do, but every so often she would like be like we would get called to the hospital, come say goodbye. So we'd all gather there, and then somehow or other she would like pull through, and then she would live for like another 5 or 6 years. That happened. Um, I
that's
think towards
really,
the
that had to be
middle.
really tough on your parents.
Yeah, yeah, it took a toll for sure. And
Oh,
so it's like 2 years since she passed. Definitely, you can see that my parents are recovering still,
yeah,
but
yeah.
um, it's tough for them. I mean, because of the demands that her health kind of required, they ended up moving in like right next door to her. So my mom was there constantly, like just she was sort of the primary caregiver, and they did have some hired help and stuff that was able to carry some of the burden, but she had to coordinate a lot of that as well. So it was just a ton on her, and and then when she passed, she's just living right next door to where all this happened. So it's just kind of this like it's really hard. It's
Yeah.
been um, but yeah, I mean, for me, sort of my model of faith, my role models of faith are my parents who are just so faithful, just humbly serving. And so, it's interesting to see that. I think just in the last couple of years, I've started unpacking a little bit of like what that actually was like for me. Um, and I think for all of us, like when I talk to my siblings and my nephew, who's, I'm certain that he's probably watching this, uh, her son, uh, I've been trying to get him into the TLC. So hi, Nate. This is this is probably your first
I guess we're
Vanderplay experience,
sharing
but
this.
but hopefully I can kind of rope him into the TLC. But um, yeah, it was kind of interesting to see because there was a lot of years there where you're praying for things that just don't come about,
Yeah.
for healing, for comfort, and for me, it's just sort of like this tailing off of like your prayers become less and less bold, I guess. Like you just kind of like pray for like smaller and smaller things because you just kind of think, well, it's not going to happen.
How many kids did she have? You mentioned Nate. Any others? Just Nate?
Just the one. Yeah, she was only able to have Nate. So yeah, so he's 24 now. He's great, 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 great kid. Um, and yeah, he's one of my closest friends, like without a doubt. He's one of the only people that I can actually talk to about TLC stuff. He's going to Bible school now. He's getting a master's in spiritual formation,
Okay.
which which is really cool to see. So um, yeah, she was so proud of him, and we all are. But um, yeah, I remember telling Nate because it's tough. I think when your mom is the one who's so sick, and it just puts a huge burden on your life.
It does.
And I think it was probably for a number of years really hard for him to sort of appreciate some aspects of her because it was so demanding.
Right. Well, MS is one of these diseases that robs you of the person
Yeah.
before death finishes the job.
It's
And
very true. Yeah, it had a massive impact on her just cognitive abilities, and
yeah,
her executive function
yeah,
was faulty. Like she couldn't make sense of what decisions needed to be made at a given time.
yeah,
So sometimes she would just get fixated on things, and she'd be like, "We need to get more like spinach dip or something. Like you have to go to the store and get the spinach dip." And everyone would be looking around and be like, "You have it in the fridge. Like it's not." But she would just need it, you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
And it was just like constant, just little things that she'd always need. But she was so saintly as well. Like she
Mm,
really, truly, like I told Nate shortly after she passed, it's like you read through the history books and you get to know the saints of old. Like she stacks up with any of them that you're going to read, truly. And the way that she just bore her burden, and um, it was it was really like the model of like how to suffer well, because she was, even though she wasn't, maybe cognitively able as she could have been, she really was so pure hearted. Like she really loved other people. She was so considerate and thoughtful. And um, I mean, she told me this would have been 10 years maybe before she passed. And she and I went for lunch one day, and I was kind of telling her like I was praying for her healing and things like that. Um, and she was just like, I would love to be healed because this disease is just so hard, you know. But then she said, but there's also a part of me that's just really grateful because going through these things has made me a lot more like Christ. And she's like, and knowing myself, especially when I was younger, if this hadn't happened, she's like, I would have ended up becoming really selfish, really arrogant, I don't know. She had this self awareness of like what was happening. Like she could still see God's hand at work,
yeah,
She never lost that.
yeah.
Um, but I think like for me, it was kind of, I don't know, you get the sense that like faith is just kind of about faithfulness, it's just kind of about like bearing your burden and being responsible. And like I kind of mentioned, like you kind of get this sense of expectation, especially in prayer, that like, God just doesn't really, he might answer other people's prayers, but he doesn't answer mine. And it wasn't until probably just a couple of years ago that I started unpacking that, because I just kind of like internalized it. That was a huge, I think that's a huge part of my faith development is, and in some ways it's like a really good one. It's like my role models are people who are just faithful. They were just godly. They loved other people,
Yeah.
and even though it was like really hard to do, especially for my mom, well, for both my parents, but my mom was carrying a lot of that. It's like, yeah, I mean, it's formative for me, and I think we need a lot more of that. To be honest with you,
Yeah, well, it's an ironic thing to say because everybody needs a disaster in their life. Well, sort of. We don't wish it. I mean, Peterson posted on Twitter a couple of days ago one of his aphorisms, find the heaviest thing that you can lift and lift it, something like that. And it's like often the really heavy things you don't have to look for. They find you.
mm,
And and you know, while Peterson is right, the voluntary aspect is important. Probably one of the most important things I've ever heard Peterson say. It wasn't in his class lectures or anything. It was when he was talking about his akathisia and that period of his life of a lot of pain. He said, I had to make sure I didn't become bitter
mm,
because you can survive, your soul can survive MS, but bitterness will kill your soul.
yeah,
And so when you talk about your sister, I would imagine, yeah, it's easy to see how hard it was for your parents. It's easy to imagine how hard it is for her son, but of course she was also bearing that burden. And the irony of suffering calamity when you're a committed Christian is sometimes you bear a double burden because you're the idol that you have within you that, well, if I'm a Christian, these things aren't supposed to happen to me. I didn't do anything to deserve this. I've lived a moral life. I've praying to the right God. And so yeah. And I've often noted that the people whose faith I admired, they have always had something in their life that they couldn't overcome.
Hmm.
And it was how they interacted with what they couldn't overcome would be part of what would develop that faith that I would see and recognize and appreciate.
Hmm. Yeah,
But it's you know it's a hell of a thing because you know I wouldn't wish your sister's story on anyone.
no, yeah, nor would I. Um, it was interesting seeing her go through it because I think she had when I like that story I was telling, I was about 10 years before she passed. She'd made peace with it at that point. But a few years before that, around about the time, so Nate had been born, she was in a wheelchair for probably the last 12 or 13 years of her life. So right around that transition point where she lost the ability to walk, she went through a season of kind of it would be grief is really what she was going through, but there was a
Yeah,
lot of expressed bitterness and things
yeah,
like that. Like
yeah,
all she was coming to an awareness that like her hopes and dreams in life weren't going to happen, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I remember I can't remember the exact time frame around this, but I do recall, um, she had some friends, and they came from sort of more of like a signs and wonders kind of charismatic tradition,
Yep.
and they came to her because they wanted to like pray for her healing and stuff, and they kind of had this theology of like it's Jesus has his body was broken so ours could be healed, and so it's always
Yeah,
God's desire to heal,
yeah,
and so they kind of laid that forward and was like, you just got to pray and accept, and I think she carried that actually for quite a while, um, because you get that laid on you, and then you think, well, I'm not getting healed, so then it's like it's my fault because my faith or whatever. She had to wrestle through quite a bit of that, and I think we all kind of did, in a way, watching it and just kind of being like, because it just there's tons of just unresolved questions that linger in your heart, and that's why I'm saying it's like it's probably not until maybe the last 2-3 years that I even became aware of the fact that I had these questions. How do I relate to God in the aftermath of her passing and those sorts of things? And yeah, so